I'm Jim Long. I am a research scientist with USGS, with the Oklahoma Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. I was asked if, I've been researching Neosho Bass for a long time. I'm a fisheries biologist. I'm particularly excited to present here because we get to bring together science, management, and culture. And this is one of the few events that I saw where we can do this. In my professional line of work, I attend fish meetings. We talk about otoliths and meristics and genetics, and we don't get to the culture side of it. We may get to the management side of it, but we don't get to the culture side of it. So what we have today is we have a panel of 3 presentations. Myself and my invisible co-author, Dr. Andrew Taylor, are going to talk about the science of Neosho Bass. Following that up is Jeremy Risley. He is the Black Bass Program Coordinator for Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. He is going to follow up with management of Neosho Bass. And then we have Kyle Veit with the Ozarks podcast. He's going to follow up with Neosho Bass as a status symbol. So what we decided to do for this panel is run these 3 presentations back to back to back, and then we'll do a Q&A afterwards. So without further ado, Neosho Bass, new species on the block, Ozark status symbol. This is the science. So I have become a bit of an aficionado of history late, because placing this new species into the historical context is important. So to start at where it all began, Neosho bass is a kind of smallmouth bass. Smallmouth bass was the very first what we call black bass species. Largemouth bass, smallmouth bass are the ones you've probably heard of if you fish at all. There are 19 total species. Some have not been fully confirmed yet, but there's a wealth of diversity in this group. But the very first member of this group, which is in the words of Dr. James Henshaw, the apostle of black bass, eminently American. Black bass are only occur natively in North America. So it is a purely North American species. But when the country was being founded, after the Revolution, there was a big interest in natural history. But there wasn't the institutions necessarily in the U.S. to do those descriptions. So the very first bass that was ever described was a smallmouth bass. It was captured somewhere on the East Coast, we don't know exactly where, and then sent to France, because that's where you sent things to go get scientifically described. BGE Lassapé described the very first specimen. He named it, so a bit of a backup, all animals and organisms, they have binomial nomenclature, two names, a genus and a species. And when you get to make a new genus, that's a big thing, because that's a high-level organism, right? So this was a new genus that he described, because again, these fish don't occur in Europe. So this was totally unknown to him. So he called it based on what he thought was the most distinguishing characteristic available. And there is a laser on here, yes? Oh, you can't see it. This piece right here, and here is the original French and a Google Translate version down below, the Micropterus. Very remarkable, their second dorsal fin separates them. This was for him a tiny third dorsal fin, 1 fin, 2 fin, 3. Micropterus means small fin. So the whole group, the entire species was named for this. And then it was given Dolomieu, Micropterus Dolomieu, named for his friend and geologist, Dolomieu, for whom the Dolomites are named after. Turns out that this specimen was damaged. This is not a distinguishing characteristic, but the rules of naming species means that even if it doesn't actually fit, it sticks. And so our entire genus of the group of black basses are named for this damaged specimen. Okay, 1802. So a long time went by. Again, it's a period of discovery. There's a lot of things being discovered. And, you know, the country, it's hard to imagine without internet, really without trains. the ability to travel and move information from one place to another is very limited. So actually, smallmouth were described multiple times. Largemouth bass were described multiple times. Well, James Henshaw, in 1881, he is known as the apostle of black bass. He was the fiercest proponent of, we need to fish for this species and not trout. Remember, it was European colonists that came over. Trout are native to Europe. They're also native to the US. So that's what people tended to fish for, what they knew. This black bass thing is a whole different thing, right? Well, James Henshaw, it was like his life's mission to change that. So in 1881, he took it upon himself to write the seminal book on the science and fishing for black bass, called the Book of Black Bass. And of course, in what's commonplace at the time, there's a giant, colon after that title. So for him, he said, listen, there have been lots of discoveries, but there's only two, largemouth and smallmouth. This book is still influential today. This book still gets cited today. There are people who are still referencing Dr. Henshaw's work today. It's hugely influential. So when he says there's only two species, everybody said there's only two species. So it wasn't until 60 years later when another well-known set of ichthyologists, Carl Hubbs and Reeve Bailey, they traveled the country describing new species. So the science of species description has gotten a little more scientific. Now, we're counting things and we're measuring things. We're using numbers, right? We're not just thinking, oh, it looks different. We're going to put some numbers to it. We're going to use some hard science. And so the science of that is called meuristics and morphometrics. And using a series of counts and measurements, they found that the species of smallmouth bass that occur in the Ozarks, in the streams that drain to the Arkansas River, and it's wonderful that we're here, right here. So the Barren Fork River is just that away. The Illinois River is just that away. Those two places are like the heart of Neosho bass country, right here. They said that there's enough evidence to declare it a subspecies. So now we have a new subspecies, the Neosho smallmouth bass. And so if you want to look at a map now, here's kind of what we know about smallmouth bass. Smallmouth bass is really a northern species, Ohio, Michigan. It's a Mississippi River drainage species. It doesn't occur very far south. It's not tolerant of warm temperatures. It really needs more cooler waters. But then now we know that in this part of the Ozarks, draining to the Arkansas River, there's at least a different form. And the way things were done at the time, we typically, it's not quite different enough to be something, fully different species, so now we're going to do a lot of subspecies. And this was pretty common at the time. Lots of subspecies were being described at the time. So this is an interesting quote that I'll get to later. So the holotype, this is the one specimen that they used as the representative of the whole group, okay? The holotype is the largest specimen examined, but the subspecies no doubt attains a much greater size since the habitat of this form is famous for smallmouth bass fishing. In other words, we took a small fish, I think it was 8 inches. That's what we described the subspecies from. But it's got to get a lot bigger than this, right? Because look at these great streams. Of course it gets bigger than this. This is great habitat. So the holotype there, it's in a museum. You can actually go and look at this exact specimen if you really want to. They describe it as a subadult male, 197 millimeters in total length. That's about 8 inches. And they say in the 3rd summer of its life, which means it's had its 2nd birthday and it's in its 3rd year. That's okay. So a little into now, but you have to know now some other past history. And I'm going to bring up Lake Tenkiller. And again, this is Lake Tenkiller. We are somewhere, right in here right now. I believe that's right. Lake Tenkiller in Oklahoma was built on the Illinois River. It was, so you put a big concrete wall in the middle of a river and let it fill up. That's what makes a reservoir. So Lake Tenkiller was built in 1953. So 13 years or so after we know that, yes, Neosho bass is a subspecies at least. It's in the range of the Neosho bass. But soon after the lake was constructed, it was pretty apparent that there's no bass in the lake. And so that always intrigued managers. Soon after World War II, fishing skyrockets. There is a huge need and desire for recreation. Fishing and boating is one of those things that get filled. And folks love to catch smallmouth. They're a great fighter. So they're complaining to the State Natural Resource Agency, where's our smallmouth? We don't have smallmouth. So in 1990, the state of Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, said, okay, there's no native bass or native smallmouth, so let's go get some that we know are tolerant of lake conditions. And those are the Tennessee strain smallmouth. So they went over to Tennessee in the Cumberland drainage and physically moved some over into the lake. And we now have smallmouth in the lake, big smallmouth. So it worked, right? It worked. A lot of anglers are happy about that. We figure out genetics, though, sometime in the early 90s. We're doing a lot more genetic studies. So one of the seminal papers then that come out, and this is in 1998, this was out of Oklahoma State, Bill Stark and Tonia Kelly. They did a range-wide assessment of smallmouth bass in the interior highlands, the Ozarks and the Ouachitas. And they wanted to see how much variability in genetics there are. And at the time, the tool we're using is allozymes. The science at the time, the technology wasn't there to actually look at DNA itself. We can't look at the A, T, C's, and G's, but we can look at what those A, T, C's, and G's make. And those are proteins, allozymes. And based on allozymes, they said that there is enough data to suggest that the range, the subspecies of Neosho smallmouth bass are very distinct genetically. There's also a couple more in the Ouachitas that also appear to be very distinct genetically. Well, the result of that study, though, was Oklahoma said, oh, we didn't know that those smallmouth that we had that weren't in our Tenkiller reservoir are really genetically different. We are going to stop stocking the other form. So that was a very big management decision. And so now the map of what we know at the time, we've got smallmouth bass in this part of the world. We've got always had this subspecies, but now we know it is genetically distinct. And we now know there's another genetically distinct critter down there too, which was being dubbed the Ouachita bass. So this is bringing now more attention to conservation. In 2010, I was a part of a group of scientists that went to Washington, D.C., and we carved out a business plan for conserving native black bass species. I mentioned there were like 19 different species. Most of them have these very small ranges in the southeastern U.S. And so this would be Neosho bass right there. Neosho bass was included in that list right down there. And we noted that one of its, we didn't know what its conservation status was, but one thing we did know was there was a high threat of invasiveness because we knew that they had stocked non-native smallmouth in its range. And then, from there, the amount of science really starts to ramp up on these endemic small range species. We put out a book on black bass diversity. In that book, we included a whole chapter on biology and ecology of Neosho smallmouth bass, which had not been assembled before. We had a paper come out in Fisheries magazine in 2019. And again, there we said that for all of these species, one of the biggest threats to all of them is hybridization from stocking non-native bass. And then lots of stuff could start coming out. all over the place in this part of the world. Folks at University of Arkansas, those of us at Oklahoma State, University of Missouri, lots of papers now coming out on what is Neosho bass. And so this is probably, so I was thinking about this the other day. You know, when you put a puzzle together, you start with the borders, right? You know those fit, and you don't really get the insides until the border is complete. Two things happened that completed the border of the puzzle of Neosho bass. Kim et al., for which my co-author Andrew Taylor was on, they did a range-wide, the largest study of black bass across the country using the most advanced genetic tools available. And they said that the evidence is sufficient enough that this subspecies should be a full species. So it was elevated. Since it already had a description, it was easy to just elevate it to a new species. So now we have someone saying, we think this is no longer Neosho smallmouth bass, it's just Neosho bass. And then the very next year, the American Fisheries Society published their list of accepted scientific and common names, and they included that on their list. This completed the border of our puzzle. This is a species. So then what do we know about it as a species? Well, not really a whole lot. It looks a lot like any other smallmouth. There's some fine differences. We know that it's more slender. The head's a little more slender. It's a little more torpedo-shaped. This lower jaw probably projects a little farther beyond its nose than a regular smallmouth. There's some color differences. There might be some dorsal ray count differences if you count them. I think the original subspecies designation said 75% of the species had one ray different than another. We think it probably is smaller. And again, based on some things we know when we impounded systems and Neosho bass not being there, we think it's intolerant of those reservoir conditions. But that's about it. And so I'm going to come back now to the 1940 description of the subspecies. And remember, those authors said that the Holer type is, the smallest we could get, but it was small, but no doubt it gets bigger. No doubt. At the time, this is what you would expect for a Neosho bass. And so if you're a manager in the 90s and you have this in the back of your head that we know that there should be bigger ones, then you're going to think like a manager should, and you're going to say, listen, in this part of the world, maybe we need a different length limit that could reduce abundance of smallmouth bass so that we can enhance growth rates, right? We know these fish are small, but surely they can get bigger. So this is a graph of length at age. So this is essentially, growth. 14 inches is pretty typical for a size limit for a lot of states. And for a lot of anglers, 14 inches is a good size, to catch and take home and eat, right? So I use that bar as a measure. 1950s, I was able to compile some data from the 50s, and you can see that Neosho bass in the 50s were not really getting to 14 inches. And they're only living to be about 4 years old. And in the 90s, we got a few now, so maybe some management tactics are working, but they're still living only 6 years. They're not very long-lived. So remember though, so this is the Illinois River system, which is connected to Lake Tenkiller. We stocked smallmouth there, and those smallmouth are now in the river. They have moved their way up. They're hybridizing with Neosho bass. So we have a whole mix. We have pure smallmouth, pure Neosho bass, and a lot of hybrids in between. So what we did was we took growth data, coupled it with genetics data, so we know exactly what's what. This is what we call in science a common garden experiment. We take something from somewhere else, put it in a different environment, common with the other species, and see what happens, right? So Neosho bass, genetically determined in the 1920s, are only living to be about 5, and they rarely get to 14 inches. Non-native smallmouth are easily passing 14 inches. They're getting 21, 22 inches. You can find smallmouth like this in the Illinois River now that you never could find before. And they're also living to 9 or 10 years old. So in other words, it was never the environment that affected Neosho bass growth. It's their biology. Neosho bass are Neosho bass. They don't grow fast, they don't grow big, and they don't live long. Because when you put something in the same environment, they take off.
Okay, so like Jim said, my name is Jeremy Risley, and I am the Arkansas Game and Fish statewide black bass coordinator. And while I come to you as a fisheries biologist, I tend to be more proud of the fact that I've been told that my family arrived in the Ozarks sometime around the mid-1800s. So my family's been here a really long time, so I'm proud to be from the Ozarks. I grew up here, and I try to brag about living in the Ozarks and growing up in the Ozarks whenever I can. So I'm excited to present this, but more excited to be here representing, like most of you all, the Ozarks and Arkansan. So I'm just going to talk to you kind of about how the Game and Fish is going to be managing the Neosho bass moving forward. So I'm going to be talking a lot about fish management today. So I thought I would give you all an idea of what is fish management. So here's the typical definition you'll see in the dictionary, but in reality, it is fish, habitat, and people, or anglers. And each one of these are unique. Each one of them can impact the other, and each one of them provides an opportunity to enhance the fishery itself. So you're going to see my talk centers around this, and if you've sat through fisheries talks in AFS or state talks, you're going to see a lot of times we gravitate to fish, habitat, and people when we try to explain what we're doing. So I tailored this presentation to be kind of like an hourglass. So I'm going to start out like a really high 30,000 level, and by the time we're done, we're going to be on the ground with Neosho bass. So why are we even talking about fishing in Arkansas? Well, the last survey found that there was nearly 350,000 anglers in the state, and they spend about 13.4 million angler hours. And 36%, or about a third of the anglers that fish in Arkansas, are fishing for black bass. That's the preferred species. And of those, they spend about 5 days a year on average fishing in streams. So stream fishing, particularly in the Ozarks, is very important to the state. So that's why we're talking about fishing in general in Arkansas. Now, with this importance of having a high percentage of anglers that both fish for black bass and like to fish in streams, we have a stream smallmouth bass plan. And this last edition, which is our third edition, was approved in 2021. And during that, we talk about, or we address things like going out and sampling the stream populations, understanding their genetics, understanding their habitat, how to protect flows, how to protect habitat, restoring stream banks, just anything related to the habitat of those smallmouth bass. And then finally, how do we incorporate the anglers into the management? So when this was done, we, as an agency, we really did not separate things out. So in the plan, we focused on smallmouth bass in general. And you can see this was brought up to the USGS. They still have smallmouth bass as one species throughout Arkansas. So you can see, as Jim mentioned, Arkansas is kind of unique. We're kind of at that really southern range of the smallmouth bass range. So again, this is kind of how that plan was made, is really focused on smallmouth bass themselves. And as Jim said, Kim and all came along in 2022, and they really helped us understand what's going on in Arkansas. So you can see here we have the smallmouth bass that extends from Arkansas up into Canada. They're found throughout most of the Ozarks. And then the Neosho bass is just found in the in the Arkansas River Valley, and also into Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri. So there's 4 states for Neosho bass. And then we also have the Ouachita bass and the Little River bass, which are Ouachita mountain species. So if the rain falls into the west part of the Ouachita's, that's the Little River bass. And if it falls and goes east, it is the Ouachita bass. But today we're here to talk about the Neosho. So again, Neosho is just kind of found in that Arkansas River Valley. And Ethan is here, and using a bunch of his pictures, and we're thank you for him for getting some pretty cool pictures of showing us the difference. So how do we, when we get to the Neosho bass, like how do we conserve the species and what challenges are associated with that? So the first one is, now that we kind of have been told that there's these two described species and two undescribed, soon to be described species, where do they occur on a fine scale? We know, again, that the Neosho bass is found in the Arkansas River Valley, but like what streams themselves are found? So we have partnered with U of A to understand the distribution of all these 4 fish through the state, and this will be wrapped up this summer. And this will give us a fine-tuned look at where these fish are found. And then once we kind of understand, when we go into a stream, whether this is a Neosho or a smallmouth bass, then we can really fine-tune the biological information that we're collecting. And like Jim mentioned, some of the things that we know at this point is that smallmouth can, especially in the Ozarks, can exceed 20 inches. They can live to 10 years plus. But the Neosho bass rarely exceeds 14 inches and rarely lives past 7 years old. So there is these differences, and we'll be able to really fine tune this over time when we kind of collect stream by stream data. So that's where we go from the fish aspect. And for us, the habitat component is probably the most critical. As an angler, we tend to think that the angler component is probably the most important, but in reality, for these stream fish, habitat is number one. And there's these physical impacts that can impact Neosho bass, is like altered stream flows, changes in water temperature, sedimentation. There's various aspects that can influence the habitat. And often to restore these is very expensive and time consuming. So getting ahead of the game on these and understanding them will make it easier in the long run and cheaper to restore those. And again, the Neosho bass is part of that southernmost range. So they're under influences of factors like extreme temperature that regular smallmouth or northern smallmouth may not be. So they're uniquely adapted to their habitat. So that's one of the reasons we want to conserve them, is they've evolved in this area and can handle the extremes. And it's really eye-opening when we collecting fish for the Ouachita and the Little River. They live in some water bodies that look vastly different than the Ozarks. So we're learning a lot about their habitat, and really explains why they're important and why we should be protecting them. So oftentimes the angler component is the kind of one that is most difficult from a day-to-day type. So when it comes to Neosho bass, it's the expectations. If you go and fish Kings River, Buffalo, Kruger Creek, anglers are expecting to catch 18, 19, 20-inch fish and catch 14-inch smallmouth bass on regular occurrences. Whereas we know, Jim mentioned that in the Neosho bass, they rarely get 14 inches. So if an angler goes into the Illinois River and that angler's only catching 14-inch or fish or smaller, they're going to be disappointed because they're under that expectation that they should be catching these 18, 20-inch fish. So we need to work on this expectation that the Neosho bass doesn't get as big. So a 14-incher is like a trophy. It's kind of like, in our world, anglers that fish for bluegill. If you go out and you catch a bunch of 10-inch bluegill, that's a really good day. And if you catch a 12-inch bluegill, that's like a giant. So we just kind of need to work on anglers' expectations. Another thing that we're really concerned with is what we call bait bucket introduction. And basically that just means that an angler is taking fish from one water body and moving it to the other. And we know from Lake Tenkiller that there were anglers there that really wanted to catch 20-inch smallmouth in their favorite part of the Illinois River. So they moved fish from the lake up to areas that were inhabited by Neosho bass. So we really don't want that to occur because we know of hybridization. So sometimes the anglers believe that have good intentions, but in reality they are making long-term impacts. And then finally, from an agency component, it is how do we our management style? Are we managing versus conserving? So in situations where we have smallmouth bass in the Ozarks, like Crooked Creek or Buffalo, we know that those populations are booming and are self-sufficient. So we're going to manage those for quality or trophy or some method that produces really big fish. Like the anglers are coming to catch high numbers of really big fish. Whereas with the Neosho bass, we know that conservation is more important. So our regulation or management is going to be conserving that species for a long term instead of quality. We're just trying to sustain that species for a long time. So what lies ahead with our management of the Neosho bass? The big one is, for the fish component, is hybridization. We want to make sure that smallmouth bass are not being introduced into Neosho waters, ensure that we have these pure strains of Neosho bass. We need to learn about the habitat and understand the critical habitat so we can protect that. And then finally, we're looking at maybe having an angler reporting tool, because the Neosho bass is found in a lot of streams that we have a really difficult time sampling, getting our equipment and effectively sampling the fish. But we know angling is highly effective in these smaller streams. So having an angler reporting tool where an angler goes into the Neosho waters and catches it, maybe have an online reporting tool so we can get that data, and that kind of helps us from a management angle, but it also helps from an angler angle as well. And then our hopes are in 2028 that we will revise our stream. It will be our stream black bass plan at that point, and we will have all black bass species in there, including the Neosho bass. So that's kind of like the management aspect, but there's still one opportunity that lies ahead for us, and that is from a conservation standpoint. And recently, Jim and I met the first meeting of the Neosho Bass Working Group, and that is a group involves biologists from Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Arkansas, and we're going to be meeting yearly to basically work together amongst the states to conserve Neosho bass for the long run. And then we plan on outreaching with partners. Kyle do outreach and show the need for the conservation of these species. And then finally, we don't want to forget about the local anglers. Meeting with anglers in the Neosho watershed, the smallmouth watershed, and getting what are the value choices or what do they want from a conservation standpoint for Neosho bass. And then finally, we're excited about in the upcoming years, developing a stream smallmouth bass slam. And that basically, that will have the 4 species, or the 2 species and 2 undescribed species, but nowhere else in the world can you catch those 4 within a state border in the United States. So we want to bring attention to that. It's a unique thing, but it also gives us an opportunity to speak about the conservation and the uniqueness of needing to conserve these species. So we're pretty excited about that. Again, we know that some anglers are going to be concerned about that, bringing attention to this area, especially maybe their favorite honey hole may have a few more anglers, but we feel like this is an opportunity to show that how unique these species are and why they need to be conserved. So in conclusion, we feel like the Neosho bass, like Kyle mentioned in his podcast, is the symbol of Ozark. And why that is, because it's highly unique. But with its uniqueness, it does provide some challenges and opportunities that we're going to be facing in the next couple of years. And with that, I'll give it over to Kyle to talk about why we believe this is a symbol of the Ozarks.
My name is Kyle Veit. I am a 6th generation resident of the Ozarks, and I am proud to be the host of the Ozark podcast. As you mentioned, as it's been said, we cover a lot of things. We started as a hunting and fishing podcast, but over the last 3 years of doing the show, we've morphed into something a little bit different. We cover hunting and fishing still, but we also talk a lot about culture and ecology and history and folklore and really everything that represents the Ozark identity. And so today, what I'm going to talk to you about is a symbol of the Ozarks. And in doing the show over the last 3 years, if I've learned anything, it's that the Ozark identity is strong. And perhaps in some ways it's never been stronger. We've seen over the last 3 years a community of about 80,000 people follow along with us on our show. We typically see about 17,000 downloads a month on our weekly podcast. And we're a top 100 podcast in the country in the outdoor category. And I don't say these things to say that I'm special or anyone on my team is special. It's really, I believe, people want to hear stories from the Ozarks. And more than that, people want to experience that deep connection to the places that they live. And so the story that I'll be telling you today about the Neosho Bass is a story that runs as deep as any other and is as uniquely Ozark as any other story that we have. So the Neosho Bass is a symbol of the Ozarks, but to make that claim, we have to define what is a symbol to begin with. So this is a picture. Hopefully you guys know what this is. It's a bald eagle. Can anyone engage the crowd? Can anyone tell me what they think of when they see a bald eagle? What are some thoughts that come to your mind?
United States.
United States, sure. Dr. Blevins, what do you got?
I was just thinking a pretty buzzard.
A pretty buzzard. Not the answer I was looking for. But typically, you think America, you think of freedom, you think of our country, our values. This is a concept, an idea. What if I said, the bison or the buffalo? What might you think of?
American West.
Yep. The West, the frontier, a frontier spirit, right? These symbols can represent more than just an animal. Nobody said, besides Dr. Blevins, nobody said it's a bird, right? Or a big bison, it's a big cow-like animal. So it represents a concept or an idea. Symbols can also represent places as regional identifiers. So imagine for a second you were an artist and you were asked to paint a picture of the Arizona desert. You might include something like a cactus, or specifically maybe a saguaro cactus to go into a species. If you were asked to paint the Everglades of Florida, you might include an alligator. And similarly, if you were asked to paint a picture of the Deep South or Savannah, Georgia, you'd likely use some live oaks with some Spanish moss hanging down, that beautiful scene that we all know. And so if you think about it, a symbol represents these two things. And when you combine a concept with a place or a setting, and now combine in a character, those are the basic building blocks of a story. And so symbols, they belong to a place, but they don't just exist. They tell a story, and more times than not, their story is our story. So what makes some species symbolic while others are not? Typically, like I said, they'll represent a place and a people and a history. If you look at the state animal of Missouri, for example, it is the mule, the Missouri mule. The Missouri mule talks about the history of Missouri. The mule, Missouri was one of the leading producers of mules for a time, and it was integral in trade and agriculture in the early days of settling in that state. And so they recognized it as a state symbol. Symbols can ignite a sense of pride. So do we have anyone here from Texas? I know I've got at least one in the back, my beautiful wife. So Texans, we all know Texas pride. They're very proud of where they're from. And when a Texan sees a longhorn cattle, they beam with pride inside. And it's got roots. That breed has roots in Spain, but it was actually developed in the Southwest and in Texas, and it talks to the history of cattle ranching and cattle drives in Texas and represents that independent spirit. And then symbols can also inspire protection. So this is the power of a symbol. Who in here knew that the state of Arkansas used to be called the Bear State? Nodding heads. Did anyone know that we almost lost the bear completely in the state of Arkansas? In the early 1900s, it was thought that we've got less than 50 bears left in the entire state. And in many places, it was completely gone. But now, today, the reintroduction of the black bear in Arkansas is considered one of the most successful reintroductions of a large carnivore anywhere in the world. And it's because it was a symbol, it was protected. Given the audience, I'm sure a few of you are familiar with the Ozark chinkapin. This is a tree that is relative of the chestnut family, part of the chestnut family, and it's been protected. There's the Ozark Chinkapin Foundation, and their whole mission is to protect this tree. Outside of the Ozarks, the native brook trout in Appalachia and the giant sequoia in California, these are species that have been protected because of their symbolism. And so if you look at these symbols and these species, what they have in common is they speak to who we are, where we come from, and what we value. And that's why we seek to protect these species, because they collectively kind of form our sense of identity. And so we protect them to protect ourselves. And likewise, when we lose them, we feel like we're losing a piece of ourself, a piece of our history. So what do we have in common with the Neosho Bass as Ozarkers? Well, in Ozark history, you typically see themes of isolation and uniqueness. And so in the same way that the Neosho Bass was isolated from the rest of the black bass population in the geographical uplift of the region and the natural barriers, the 19th century and the early settlers of the Ozarks and the Scots-Irish and the Anglo-Americans, they settled in isolated communities that were typically cut off from the rest of the world in some regard. Because of that, the isolation preserved the distinct lineage genetically of the Neosho Bass, and likewise in people, we were able to preserve distinct customs, dialects, traditions, and stories. And then lastly, in terms of the uniqueness, the Neosho Bass, just like people, has been overlooked, underappreciated, stereotyped, and on the fish side, not appreciated for, like Jeremy was talking about, the size of the fish. It's not going to get as big, and so people don't always go and target it. And people in the Ozarks, we've got the hillbilly stereotype, the poor, uneducated people, that is not always true. The second theme I wanted to highlight was displacement and competition. The Neosho Bass was displaced by the construction of dams and reservoirs. Similarly, the native and original inhabitants of the Ozarks in the Osage, and then later the Cherokee, they were pushed from their lands and displaced from their core territories. You've also got, on both sides of the page, you've got, they were condensed to smaller areas. So the Neosho was pushed, when the lakes were built, pushed up into the smaller streams where they prefer. And the native people, they were pushed from their lands and forced to relocate to smaller areas of reservations. And then in terms of competition, with the introduction of the smallmouth bass, you had hybridization starting to occur immediately. And the same way that you had cultural assimilation happening. And then I thought this was interesting, even the motivations behind the displacement and the competition, they have similarities. Both of them really, at the end of the day, driven by somewhat of a greed or a want for more. On the fishery side, you've had the desire for more sport fishing, recreational tourism, and then on the people side, expansion, settlement, commercial ventures like mining, things like that. And then lastly, the resilience and survival of these two. For a fish, it's really hard to live in shallow, clear water. That is like the worst place you could be for a fish. You're prone to heavy predation. And Neosho bass, their life is challenging from the moment they're born. They're being pursued by bigger fish. As they get older, otters and minks and raccoons will eat them, foxes. And if they dodge those, they still have cranes and herons to deal with. And if they dodge all those, they still have me and Jim and Jeremy out there in the stream trying to catch them. So it's a hard place to live for a fish. And similarly, the Ozarks are a tough place to live as well. Some people see the Ozarks as uninhabitable just because of the rocky ground, the rugged soil. It is not an ideal place to set up camp in a lot of times. adaptation. Both groups have had to adapt over time. The Neosho in terms of pollution and ecological changes from damming. And people, past and present, as people started pushing westward, they're adapting to new environments. And as Native Americans were pushed further west, they had to adapt to new environments as well. And even today, you see, with areas like Northwest Arkansas changing, you've got communities that have come in and they're adapting to a new place. People like the Marshallese people. We have in Springdale, Arkansas, the second most populated Marshallese community behind the Marshall Islands. And these are people that have adapted from a tropical island environment in the Marshall Islands to rural Arkansas. And they're a part of the Ozark community now. So that adaptation is still alive. And then just in general, the hard fighting nature, these fish are very hard to catch. And if you do catch one, they'll give you a run for your money. And people the same way in the Ozarks, they're known for their grit, self-sufficiency, and their skill and their knowledge. So we have a lot in common with this fish. And it's important to recognize why native species matter. When you combine the two and you keep them intact in the same place, you get a sense of cultural and ecological memory. And typically, we have a relationship with the land that we live on, and we share this history. And then also, in terms of ecological balance, we want to protect these native species because we want to keep the ecological identity intact as well. I mentioned, earlier the regional identifiers. If you lose those things, the pieces of that region start to fall apart and we start to lose things that make that place unique. And so, in terms of resilience and biodiversity and preventing invasive species, these are measures of health. And typically when you see a native species leave or disappear from an ecosystem, the health of the area starts to decline and you start seeing invasive species move in. And if, a really good example of an invasive species would be like a kudzu vine. If you've ever seen a hillside covered in kudzu, it moves in and it is completely shaded out and blocking all of the sunlight. And so all the biodiversity just is gone instantly from that. This quote from Aldo Leopold is, I love this. It's the first rule of intelligent tinkering is to keep all the parts. And if you think about, if you've ever taken apart something complicated with a lot of pieces, and then you try to go and put it back together again later, you only hope that you've managed to keep all the pieces together and that you didn't lose the piece that might be important. And sometimes you lose a piece and it's not important. And sometimes you lose a piece and it's the most important thing. And so we don't always know the ecological interactions between species in the wild, even in our infinite, wisdom of humans and science that we have. But the reality is, the Neosho bass population, it's not looking good. This is a survey from Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation that was done on the Illinois River. And it spanned 8 years. So the first survey was done in 2015. And they sampled genetically the population. And they saw that 42% in 2015 of the population was Neosho bass. And keep in mind, this historically would have been 100%. This was the native home range of the Neosho bass. Just 8 years later, they did the same survey and they saw the Neosho bass drop to 11% of the genetics in that river, while hybridization shot up to 68%, and the smallmouth bass actually outcompeted the Neosho in its native range. And so it's not looking good. These trends are very alarming in places like the Illinois River. But there is hope, and there are examples where hybridization has been reversed. So I want to introduce to you the Guadalupe bass. This is the state fish of Texas, and it has a very eerily similar story to the Neosho bass. It is a endemic riverine black bass that is native to the Texas Hill Country, and it similarly has had to compete with the non-native smallmouth, the Micropterus dolomieu. In the 70s and 80s, the smallmouth was introduced in the Hill Country to enhance sport fishing opportunities, and hybridization started occurring immediately. Well, in 1989, a group of third graders actually lobbied Texas government to recognize this unique fish as the state fish of Texas, and they were successful. And that recognition and that symbolism started spurring some conservation plans shortly thereafter. Well, in the 90s, the peak of the hybridization crisis occurred, and many streams saw up to 50% hybridization in these streams. And so what Texas Parks and Wildlife did is over the next 30 years, from 92 to 2020, they stocked 2.4 million genetically pure Guadalupe bass back into the streams to really try to flood the gene pool and make sure that they could, we can't completely eliminate the smallmouth, but if we can flood it with so much genetics of Guadalupe bass, maybe we can make a difference. And the result was an overwhelming success. Today, hybridization trends have completely reversed. Populations of Guadalupe bass have been restored, and recent surveys show that most of the streams that had hybridization are seeing about 90% or more pure genetic Guadalupes. So there is hope, there is a blueprint, but this doesn't happen unless the Neosho bass gets recognition, unless people know about it. Nowhere near enough people know about this fish. This science is relatively new, as Dr. Long was just talking about. And many people, even anglers, don't even know that the Neosho bass exists. And so that's why we did the podcast, was because we have this unique story in the Ozarks that nobody knows about. And you can't protect a species that people don't care about. And if you want them to care about it, they're going to have to know about it. And so the biggest thing that you can do if you care about this fish is tell someone about it. Anyone can be a conservationist. You don't have to be a podcaster. You don't have to be a conservation biologist or an ichthyologist. You can be a stay-at-home mom. You can be a teacher. You can be a writer. You can be a friend, a landowner, someone just telling someone about this fish and the story that it has. I like this definition of a conservationist is a man who knows that the world, or anyone who knows that the world is not given by his fathers, but borrowed from his children. And when I think about my children, I want my children to be given a world that is intact with the fullness of life that it was created to hold, and is still capable of sustaining. And so this isn't just about a fish. It really is about what we choose to preserve and what we're willing to let disappear. And again, it comes back to, it's not just a fish, it's a symbol, and it's a story about who we are, where we come from, and what we value, that Ozark identity.